Today we're going to be talking about deploying our wolves from the Viking wolf boats from the skies, the Stormwolf and the Stormfang. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're going to be looking at the rules for these two flying blue bricks and seeing how we can best make them work on the table. We'll go through their datasheet, any buff synergies and combos, what we could load them up with, and how I might go about using them in game. In the background, the Stormwolf and Stormfang are a specialised type of Space Marine flyer employed by the wolves, a similar sort of size and weight to the Stormraven. They have a definite sort of Viking longship vibe going on, and the prow is somewhat shaped in the silhouette of a wolf's head. Very fitting. The Stormwolf is mainly an assault transport craft, delivering a large squad of space wolves right into the heart of the battle, and armed with various heavy weapons and Hellfrost weapons to be able to provide fire support while doing so. The Stormwolf is particularly favoured by packs of battle-hungry Bloodclaws, who of course like nothing more than tearing out the heart of the foe. The Stormfang, on the other hand, is a dedicated gunship, designed to help the Space Wolves dominate the skies against their foes. Its signature weapon is the Hellfrost Destructor that runs along the length of the carapace of this vehicle, and its powerful icy beam is cold enough to shatter Ceramite, Ferrocrete and Wraithbone. Stormfang pilots are always out to seek a saga for themselves, and their craft aligned with the kill markings that they've acquired over the many years of campaigning with the Space Wolves. So let's take a look at the profile of this pair and see what they can do on the tabletop. We'll take a look at the Stormwolf, the transport pattern first. The Stormwolf is of course a flyer choice for Codex Space Wolves, and in its cheapest incarnation it will cost you 260 points, when armed with a twin Hellfrost cannon, 2 las cannons and a Skyhammer missile launcher. So it's fairly pricey, but you get a decent defensive profile for that. It's got a movement of 20 to 50, weapon skill 6, ballistic skill 3+, strength 8, toughness 7, a mighty 14 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8 and a 3+ save. As with most flyers, its defense is increased by the hard to hit special rule, meaning that it's -1 to hit when you shoot at it, provided it's not in hover mode. We all know what las cannons and the Skyhammer missile launcher does, but that twin Hellfrost cannon is interesting. It's got a 24-inch range, and you've got the option of 2 different profiles, either a dispersed or focused beam. Dispersed beam has a heavy 2d3, strength 6, AP -2 and damage 1, and the focused beam is heavy 2, strength 8, AP -4 and damage d6, so very similar to a multi-melter but without the melter rule. Instead it gets the Hellfrost rule, which in this edition means that if you suffer wounds with it but aren't slain, roll the dice and on a 6, then the target suffers a mortal wound. I've said this with other Hellfrost weapons in the past, it's really not a very strong rule at all. It only works if you both injure and also do not kill your target, and then it only works 1/6 of the time. I honestly think they could have made it quite a lot stronger. They honestly could have made it happen on a 2+, and it still would have been fine. In terms of options, it can replace that Skyhammer missile launcher with 2 twin heavy bolters, trading out 3 strength 7, AP -1 damage d3 shots that are better against fly, for 12 heavy bolter shots. This will cost you an extra 14 points, but I think against most targets it is going to be worth having the twin heavy bolters around, so I would typically upgrade to this myself. The Skyhammer's not bad, but it is a bit niche in being more restricted with the targets that it wants to be shooting at. The other option is to go really all in on the anti-tank weapons, and you can upgrade to a pair of twin multi-melters instead of those heavy bolters. The heavy bolters are 17 points apiece, and the multi-melters are 40 points apiece, putting your overall Stormwolf cost at 320 points. I think that multi-melters are a little bit better on the Stormwolf compared with most other platforms, as the range isn't quite as big of an issue as it can move ridiculously fast to get in range with all of those guns. You would really be making it into a very dedicated anti-armor platform there, as the Hellfrost cannon is basically multi-melters already, and then you have 2 twin multi-melters and then 2 las cannons, so 8 high-strength anti-tank shots coming out of the thing, though they are pretty close range. Against a typical toughness 7 vehicle, assuming that you're not within 12 inches for melter range, you'll do an average of around about 10 wounds to it, so it really can pretty much nuke a vehicle out of existence per turn. But I guess you'd be hoping this is to do that if you are investing 320 points in being able to. In terms of special rules, it has Angels of Death, which is good for a little bit of AP on those las cannons turn 1 in Devastator Doctrine. It has the normal flyer special rules, including hard to hit, supersonic for the restriction to movement, airborne for only being able to be charged by flying units, and the hoverjet special rule for if you want to ignore that, drop into hover mode and make your movement just 20 inches and be treated as a bit more of a normal vehicle. When it crashes and burns, it can potentially go up with a really big explosion. It'll do D6 mortal wounds to anything within 6 inches of it, so as per normal with these big things, you really don't want it blowing up in your own lines, and it could be worth a cheeky command point reroll to try and make it happen if there's loads of enemy units around it. Finally, it also has power of the machine spirit, so fortunately it won't be taking any penalties to shooting for moving and firing heavy weapons. Now, as we mentioned, the Stormwolf has a decent transport capacity. This thing can carry up to 16 Space Wolves infantry, so you can really pack it out with a whole ton of Space Marines. It's quite helpful in the way that it can also transport Terminator, Jump Pack and Wolfman models. Each of these take up 2 spaces in it, so you could potentially have an entire squad of Wolfmen raveling inside and ready to tear the enemy to bits. The main issue with transporting things in flyers like this is firstly the small chance that your flyer might get shot before it even gets to move. It might be at the back of your deployment zone, making your units foot slog towards the enemy. And also the fact that they can't get out the turn after it's moved, meaning that then your opponent has a turn to shoot the flyer when it's up in their face, and then potentially shoot or charge any of the units that drop out of it if and when it blows up. Even if it's carrying very expensive cargo, it is very expensive still, and you really do have to weigh up the opportunity cost with maybe just taking about twice as many of your elite infantry on the field and getting them in through deep strike or other means. We'll talk a little bit more about transport contents in a second. First though, let's talk about Stormfangs, which are essentially the gunship version of this flyer, and is 237 points when it's armed with its Hellfrost Destructor, 2 Stormstrike missile launchers, and a Skyhammer missile array. Profile and special rules wise, it's exactly the same as the Stormwolf gunship, with all the benefits and drawbacks that brings, but it has a far reduced transport capacity to make room for that Hellfrost Destructor, and it can only transport 6 Space Wolves infantry. That Hellfrost Destructor is essentially just a bigger version of the twin Hellfrost cannon with 50% extra shots, and its dispersed beam has a little bit more damage. It still has 24-inch range. The dispersed beam is heavy 3d3, strength 6, AP-2, damage 2, and the focus beam is heavy 3, strength 8, AP-4, damage d6, and it has the same slightly useless Hellfrost rule. Having damage 2 on the dispersed beam makes it a lot more handy for trying to mop up some Primaris infantry and things. Being only damage 1 on the standard Hellfrost cannon is just a little bit lackluster. The Stormstrike missile launchers are the same ones that you'd find on the Storm Raven. They're 72-inch range, heavy 1, strength 8, AP-3 and damage 3 weapons. So think a crack missile with longer range, better AP, and instead of damage d6 it's just flat 3. As with the Stormwolf, you can swap out that Skyhammer missile launcher for either the 2 twin heavy bolters or 2 multi-melters. I would choose the heavy bolters typically, or maybe think about upgrading to the multi-melters, if again you really want to go all in on the anti-tank thing that this does very well. The Stormstrike missiles can be swapped out for 2 las cannons as well. The Stormstrikes are 21 points each, and the las cannons are 25 points each, so it's basically paying 4 points to upgrade to strength 9 and d6 damage. I think they're fairly well balanced, to be honest. It doesn't really matter too much which one you choose, so basically for me it's a fairly simple trade-off of swapping 10 transport capacity for a slightly better Hellfrost weapon, and the option is to take Stormstrike missiles over las cannons if you want them, though the two are pretty well balanced. Basically, if you want to make use of a big transport capacity, then the Stormwolf is the way to go. If you want a flyer that's mainly just going to be a gunship, then the Stormfang is the way to go. So let's talk about how we can get more out of them on the tabletop. Largely as gunships, they won't be doing very much with the Space Wolf's unique doctrine or Hunters Unleashed, though if they are transporting some melee infantry, then that could be a way of helping them to do so. In terms of character support, of course, any rerolls you can get them through Battle Leaders and Wolf Lords will certainly be helpful. They're also really quite big meaty things with a lot of guns, so things like Chaplain Listeners can be perfectly reasonable on them. Having +1 to hit or +1 to wound against the nearest target certainly isn't a bad shout. I do think that with their vast movement and really needing to get close to do their damage though, they are going to struggle to synergize with characters unless those characters are either being carried within them or being deep struck alongside them. In addition, Iron Priests can also repair Stormfangs and Stormwolves, but again suffer from the same problems of being able to keep up. In terms of stratagems that you can use with the Stormfangs and Stormwolves, Armour of Contempt can be more use here than other places, particularly if they're about to take a whole load of mortal wounds in a turn. Stormfangs and Stormwolves are likely to be at the forefront of the army, and Keen Senses can be a very good use of one command point if your opponent does have -1 to hit modifiers on the units that you're targeting. From Saga of the Beast, the Space Wolves got a special one for the Stormfang gunship, which is one command point stratagem called Storm Strike. This is a pretty decent buff to its Hellfrost Destructor, and for 1 command point you add +1 to the hit, wound and damage rolls, so a very solid buff all round. If you're firing at a standard vehicle again, then Hellfrost Destructor will typically do 4 or 5 wounds, where if you activate Storm Strike, then it will typically do 9 or 10. It's actually really quite a decent buff, and if you are using a Stormfang anyway, then it's certainly one I'd think about using whenever I'm taking aim at hard targets. 1 command point for something like 5 damage on an enemy tank is really not a bad trade at all, and it certainly helps make it a little bit more relevant in the Space Wolves army list. In another really powerful buff, they also have access to Vengeance of the Machine Spirit now, the 2 command point stratagem that lets the Stormwolf or Stormfang fire with a single weapon when it dies, or automatically explode. I'm sure everyone who's watched this channel a fair bit knows how much I love auto-explosions, and auto-exploding on a d6 mortal wounds for 2 CP is absolutely great. If you are using this one aggressively, just flying it straight into enemy lines, maybe blowing some stuff up with the Hellfrost Destructor on the way, I'm sure you'll make a bit of a spectacle of yourself, and the opponent will feel the need to down your gunship. It will most certainly ease the blow to hand out d6 mortal wounds to any enemy units that are within the blast radius, which is pretty enormous off the big base of a Stormwolf or Stormfang. Under the explosion and transport rules from the main book as well, it does mean that you can also do this explosion before any passengers inside it get out. So you throw all those mortal wounds around, then any transport capacity that it still had in it manages to get out right next to it to give the enemy another threat to deal with in the coming turn. So what sort of units would I most want to transport in a Stormwolf? As per the fluff, Bloodclaws aren't actually all that bad an option. They do get to get additional attacks on the charge, which means that they can be a really hard-hitting close assault unit, whose main weakness is not being able to get up the board, which the Stormwolf pretty much fixes. It's not too bad for Wolfen either, though I'm not sure that they necessarily need it anywhere near as much, as they're a load faster and can advance and charge, meaning that by the time they've piled out their transport turn 2, they might well have reached the enemy anyway, and you could have just taken a bunch more Wolfen for the same points cost. Similarly, Terminators aren't always the best, seeing as they could just deep strike turn 2 and have a reasonable chance of making a charge if you buff them up right, but things like big units of mixed Wolf Guard could be interesting. Maybe with a bunch of power armoured ones to help with the damage dealing, and then some tanky Terminators to eat some of the damage in return. And of course, along with any unit, I'd strongly consider putting one of the slower moving special characters in there. Space Wolves have a lot of very fighty special characters, a lot of whom are slow moving, loading up things like Wolf Guard, Battle Leaders and Wolf Lords with Thunderhammers. Or maybe even an Iron Priest who is decently fighty and could also potentially heal the ship itself. Certainly seems like a reasonable include alongside the squads. You really could put some very expensive units in there, but I would bear in mind that by putting more and more units in there, you're taking a very much all eggs in one basket approach. And if you do lose the Stormwolf very early, you have the potential for quite a lot of very nice units being stranded a long way from enemy lines. In terms of the Stormfang's very reduced transport capacity, a unit of Wolf Guard, maybe plus or minus a character, could be a reasonable include there. A bunch of power armoured Wolf Guard with Storm Shields could be reasonable, and a non-trivial threat to try and remove that could be quite threatening in close combat once they do get to the enemy. We'll be looking into Wolf Guard a little bit more in a coming video. So how would I actually use the Stormwolf and Stormfang in game? As I said before, I would typically take the Stormfang unless you want a transport capacity of greater than 6, as it's just a better gun platform and has access to the excellent Storm Strike stratagem. In terms of additional guns, I'm most tempted to take the 2 twin heavy bolters, just for some all-round general firepower that's never going to be excellent against any one target, but is not really ever going to be wasted either. I think the Skyhammers are unfortunately just a touch underwhelming, and my second choice would be multi-melters if you want to invest in making it a dedicated anti-tank hunter platform. Maybe if you're certain you're going to stack it up with additional buffs. So if I was running a Stormwolf, I'd be filling it with some sort of dedicated Space Wolf melee combat that wants to be getting towards the enemy. Depending on the enemy army, I'd think about either starting it at the back of the board, if I thought that this could keep it safe and make sure it definitely doesn't die for a turn. Or if the opponent does have weapons that could reach out and kill it anyway, then it's probably best to put it somewhere towards the front of your army, so if it does go down, then at least all of its contents can get out a bit closer to the enemy. If you're going first, it doesn't really matter quite so much. You're going to have some fair degree of freedom to move it up into enemy lines. Ideally, it wants to be getting those Hellfrost cannons in range of a hard target, and also somewhere where the transport's contents are going to be able to disembark and charge into the enemy next turn. This really does lend itself to being quite bold with the Stormfang, provided you're not actually worried about getting fully surrounded and the contents not being able to get out and therefore dying, which is something that you have to worry about against hordes and things. Then I'd typically recommend throwing it somewhere right into the heart of the enemy army. Give them a hard target that they're really going to want to deal with, and a big distraction that will mean they will shoot that first as opposed to the rest of your army. and when they do kill it, your transport contents gets out, ideally into cover if possible, and if they've left enough enemy units in range, then you can spend 2 CP to hand out D6 mortal wounds to all of them. If it isn't blown up, then hopefully your Space Wolf contents can get out and charge into something nasty. And the rest of the game, your Stormwolf can be more of a gunship, maybe hovering in character auras to get a little bit of extra accuracy, maybe using its good movement to get line of sight on characters or backfill camping units, or perhaps just blocking movement lanes, which flies can still do to some extent. For the Stormfang, I'd typically be looking to do a pretty similar strategy. Obviously you don't have to worry about getting transport contents in range if you are just using it as a dedicated gunship. I'd again be trying to look to get it within 24 inches of a hard target and use that excellent stratagem, and just blaze away with the rest of the enemy army with all of its other guns. With no transport contents, you could be absolutely reckless if you wanted to be, and throw it straight into the heart of the enemy if there's somewhere for it to put down. Hopefully nuke something with the stratagem with that Hellfrost cannon, and blaze away with the heavy bolters and las cannons against anything else on the ground, before hopefully detonating whenever it's blown up, and shower the targets with mortal wounds. It's certainly not unkillable, but it's a great distraction carnifex, and one that can really punish your opponent for killing them, particularly if they have to kill it in close combat with things like smash captains or something, as it's got every chance of just killing them straight back in return when they do bring it down with Vengeance of the Machine Spirit. Overall, I think that these things are a lot more viable than they used to be, purely because of the addition of these 2 stratagems, and out of the 2, the Stormfang is my favourite. Of them are really all that tough for their points at all, so generally aren't quite as strong in a straight shooting match compared with other comparable Space Wolf units that you can pick, but the stratagem option on the Stormfang certainly helps to cover that a bit. I personally prefer the Stormfang a little bit to the Stormwolf. I'm just not quite as convinced about its ability to get units into combat easily. Just being able to get shot down either turn 1 or turn 2 really does hinder it in my mind, but I'll admit in the games that which it does work and the enemy fails to deal with it, it will likely land a decisive blow on the enemy army. In either case, I think that Saga of the Beast has really helped both of these guys out, partly through combat doctrines, but mainly through those 2 excellent stratagems, and they're a far better option in a Space Wolf list than they were before. I'm still not certain that they're top tier competitive, but I think that these new options on the Stormfang in particular could really surprise an unwary opponent who's used to these things being a bit useless. So let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, and if you've had any chance to use these guys since the update, even if it might just be on Tabletop Simulator. I honestly wasn't expecting too much of them going into this review, so I'm very pleased to report that they're stronger than I otherwise thought they might be. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. I think in the next video we'll be looking at covering Wolfguard, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see that. And if you have been enjoying the content recently, then any support on Patreon is greatly appreciated. It is what keeps the channel going, and I can only afford to spend so much of my time making YouTubes because of the generosity of my current Patreons, so thank you for that. If you're interested in taking a look, then the link is in the description below. You do also get to see some videos early and vote on new videos to come to the channel. In any case, a big thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.